this thing drags on long enough, they may not need to export as many going forward. It's possible we could see essentially a permanent change in the way business happens.
Thanks for joining me on the Comstock channel. I'm pleased to have Dr. Derrell Peel with me from Oklahoma State University. He's a livestock specialist there and a marketing specialist. And so there's a lot of noise in the marketplace here recently with the Mexican border situation, when that will be reopened and everything that entails and everything. And that, if you look back over the past year here, we ran up to record prices in the cattle market, largely because we have the smallest herd in the United States that we've had in decades. And then you have all these other factors that come into play with the closing of the Mexican border. And then, here recently, we've also had all the stuff with the Trump administration saying they want to lower beef prices. So with that said, Derrell, please give us your interpretation of what you think is happening in Mexico and what it means when the border does eventually reopen.
Yeah, you bet. As you noted, there's a lot of stuff going on right now that have collectively added a lot of uncertainty and volatility to the market. And so, just a quick background here, for about 30 plus years, we've averaged importing about 1.1 to 1.2 million head of Mexican feeder cattle a year. And so and we've traded cattle, or we've imported cattle from Mexico for a lot longer than that, at least a century. So it's a long-term thing. It's not a new thing. And that 1.1 million head, it sounds like a big number to some people, but put it in perspective, it's about 3.3% of our calf crop. So I think that's important to keep in mind as people think about the impact here. And one of the points you made about the markets run up and all that. And I know there are some folks that feel like, well, the reason we've had record high prices is because we did close the Mexican border. I would say that's not true. We were going to have record high prices anyway, although, taking the Mexican cattle out of the feeder supply right now certainly aggravates a tight feeder cattle supply situation. So they're not insignificant, but they're not the major factor driving the market. And that sets up the idea then of what do we expect when the border opens. It's not going to be a major factor either, I don't think, in terms of pulling the market down. But there's several considerations here. Obviously one of them is that the border's been mostly closed for a year now. We started out closing it in November last year. We were open for a couple of months early in the spring when we got about 230,000 head across. We probably would have imported something like 950,000 to a million head this year. That would have been down from the last 2 years because part of the reason they were a little bit on the tall side in terms of those exports to the U.S. was because of the drought conditions and so on in Mexico. So I don't think they would have had as many cattle in 2025 as they did in 2024 and 2023 anyway. But there's certainly some degree of a backlog in Mexico right now. So again, with everything else that's gone on, the market is just really skittish right now. And so on top of everything else, speculation about when we will open the border, I think it's when rather than if at this point, is certainly impacting the market. And so we don't really know exactly what's going on. We've not seen this before, but certainly those Mexican cattle have not all sat there all year that would have come across. They're being reabsorbed in the Mexican market. My understanding is, of course, what's happened in Mexico for a lot of years is they, mostly out of the northern third of the country is where the cattle that get exported come from, broadly speaking. And what has happened in Mexico for a long time is they have backfilled their domestic market with cattle from Central America. In fact, that's ultimately the reason why the screwworm became an issue again. And so now my understanding is the southern border of Mexico has tightened up a lot, and because they've got their own cattle to utilize in the domestic market. To what extent have they done that already? We don't know. But there's probably a 200 to maybe 400,000 head potentially still available that could cross. They're not all going to come at once. That's the other thing that I think we need to keep in mind is the border's been closed for many months. Just restaffing the border facilities. We've got extra inspections, extra protocols, quarantines because of the screwworm threat. And so if we open the border here in late November, we will get very, very few cattle across before the end of the year, maybe a few thousand head, because again, the Mexican producers have to prep those cattle. they spend a fair amount of money to export those cattle. There's a number of hoops they have to jump through. They have to get a lot of paperwork in place. The border facilities have to actually be staffed up and ready to handle cattle. And again, that's going to be a trickle rather than a flood of cattle that will come across. And with the time so short before the end of the year, we won't get hardly any yet in 2025. And it'll still be a slow process. If it stays open consistently into 2026, it'll still take several months, I think, before we would see anything like a normal flow.
Yeah, and so if you remember back to the summer time frame, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it was going to be a partial reopening, and then the whole screwworm deal flared up again, and so that's probably something what we're looking at is some of the ports of entry will be reopened, not all of them will be reopened, and as you mentioned, that will slow things down. Um, are you thinking similar to that as if we get to the reopening situation again?
Well, that would be a good guess. I mean, the USDA had come up with this phased reopening plan starting on the west side of the country, which is farthest away from where the screwworm has been found. But that's also the area where you don't get the bulk of the cattle from historically. So then it would move across. So that's another reason why I think we would get very few. As you noted, they started that in July. The border was actually open for about 48 hours before they found another case of screwworm. And reclose the border. But yeah, if they follow something like that, then that's another reason why it will be a slow process. The bulk of the cattle coming out of Mexico cross out of that Santa Teresa, New Mexico from Chihuahua into the U.S. That's the biggest port typically, which is really El Paso, but it's right on the New Mexico side of just west of El Paso is where Santa Teresa is. So that would not be the first one to open if they follow that earlier plan. And so you wouldn't get to that for some period of time, perhaps not until next year, if they follow that sort of several week phased reopening plan that they were talking about before.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something that you also said. A key point here, I think, is that the past 2 years, 2023 and 2024, we had increased exports coming out of Mexico, or imports into the United States out of Mexico. But a large part of that, you said herd liquidation there, the drought caused issues, and we know that because the heifer numbers were heavier, right?
That's exactly right. In 2023, the heifer percentage went above what it normally is. On average, for the last 10 or 20 years, about 17 or 18% of the cattle that cross are spayed heifers. That jumped up into the 20 something percent. I forget the exact number in 2023. And for 2024 through the end of November, when we closed the border, about 37 to 38% of all of the cattle that had crossed were spayed heifers. And so that indicates that they were, in fact, liquidating down there. And so, again, I think we would have seen less cattle coming. And they have seen an improvement, by the way. They did finally have a normal wet season, which starts in June. So this year, between June and about now, October, they had a pretty good normal year. Now it's semi-arid country, so a normal year means they get 15 inches of rain instead of 8 inches of rain in Chihuahua. But nevertheless, much more typical conditions. So that would have probably allowed them to stabilize, probably hanging on to some of those heifers. And of course, heifers are tricky to export anyway, right? Because the restrictions on them is a fixed time window. And that's another reason why we wouldn't get a flood of cattle, because certainly I don't think anybody's going to be moving on heifers for quite some time until they get some sense that the border is reliably going to be open. Because those spayed heifers have to get spayed. They have to have a minimum amount of time to get healed up. But then once they're healed up, they only have up to 6 months after the surgery, the spay surgery, before they have to be exported. And so it's a limited time window. So you got to have some confidence that border is going to be available and able to actually physically cross those cattle in a timely fashion when they're ready. I don't see anybody doing heifers, even if they didn't want to keep them for herd rebuilding in Mexico. I don't think they'd be trying to export any heifers anytime soon.
Yeah, so with all that said, there's a lot of factors and a lot of different impacts that could happen here. What's your best guess? And it's just a guess. But what's your best guess on when we would return to quote unquote normal number of Mexican cattle moving across the border into the United States?
That is a tough one because we obviously have never done this before. But I think if we start with all of the things we've talked about, I think we'd be halfway through 2026 before we would get back to anything like a normal flow. And there's another consideration here. Again, we know that the Mexican industry has changed a lot in the last 15 or 20 years. And I've worked down there for a long time. They've had a lot of so their ability to keep those animals and feed them, process them, and so on. Of course, Mexico's developed into a significant global beef exporting country in the last few years. And I say all that to say that if this thing drags on long enough, they may not need to export as many going forward. It's possible we could see essentially a permanent change in the way business happens. I don't think we're there yet. If it opens now, I think we probably would revert over time back to a normal flow or something close to it. But if this thing stays closed long enough, the Mexican industry may change and evolve enough that we don't see a return to this historic flow that we've had from them. So I think that's something else to keep in mind going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So that transitions perfectly into my next question. What I was going to have for you is that Mexican slaughter capacity. So there must be ramping that up and have the ability to process what they have in house right now. And so that would be a change.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, they have developed more capacity over the last decade or so. Now, again, I'm sure there's a bit of a backlog initially because of the border situation. But again, as they sort of transition to using more of their own feeder cattle production in the domestic market, again, stopping that backfilling that was coming from Central America over time, they have the ability, I think, to get to the point where they can handle all of their own cattle. And in fact, it may spawn some additional investment in infrastructure, but they've changed a lot in the last few years. The newest and most modern beef packing plant on North American continent is in northern Mexico. And that opened about 5 or 6 years ago now, I think. They've got more capabilities now than we might think they would have had even 10 or 15 years ago to reabsorb those cattle and utilize them in the domestic industry in Mexico.
Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit here. President Trump, the Trump administration, they've been beating the drum of bringing down beef prices. They've made some moves on tariffs and things like that, although the major tariffs on Brazilian beef in particular still remain in place. What's your take in terms of the policy moves and whether they will ultimately be successful in bringing down beef prices with everything that we know with the Mexican situation and everything else on the trade front?
Yeah, we have high beef prices because, as you mentioned at the beginning, that we're at multi-decade lows in our cattle inventory. We didn't intend. It's a cyclical thing. We can talk about it in the context of a cattle cycle, but in fact, we didn't intend to be this low. It was a cattle cycle liquidation that was exaggerated by about 5 years of drought. And so we didn't intend to be this low. And so, beef prices are high kind of coincidentally in terms of the fact that we're talking about food prices in general and food inflation or food prices as a part of inflation. That's the administration's concern. Beef prices are high for internal reasons, supply and demand reasons in the industry. And because of that, they are sort of inadvertently contributing to that broader inflation thing, but it's apart from all of the other inflationary things that are going on. So, and I say all that to say that the short answer is the way the beef industry works, once you're in tight supplies and the kind of cattle inventories we have, there is nothing anybody can do to change that. We're not going to bring beef prices down fast. It takes time. We haven't even gotten to the tightest part yet because we haven't started saving heifers out of a tight feeder cattle supply to rebuild the herd. And so that's still ahead of us. Now, imported beef, at the margin has a little bit of impact, mostly on the ground beef market, and changing the tariffs has a little bit of impact on that. But honestly, all of that is kind of just around the edges. I don't think it will fundamentally change things, even in the ground beef market, probably very much. And certainly nothing that we're talking about here is going to have any impact on steak prices. We're in it, and we're in it for another 2 to 4 years at a minimum before we could possibly increase the industry and production enough to change that.
Yeah, so I think you summed that up perfectly. The fundamentals haven't changed. there's a lot of other noise and exterior factors out there that could have an impact. With all that said, what's your outlook for cattle futures as we move into 2026?
Well, again, we've had just this pile on one after another, wave after wave of political things that have really pummeled futures markets especially, but it's had big impacts in cash markets as well. If we could get that turbulence to settle down for a little bit, the fundamentals will reassert themselves. I don't think we've really damaged this market from a fundamental standpoint at this point. We certainly haven't changed the supply fundamentals. I don't think we've changed the demand fundamentals. In fact, as beef production is going to continue to fall, it's falling in 2025, it's going to fall in 2026 and 2027. So we're faced with even higher beef prices going forward. Now, how that plays out exactly, if we could just get the political turmoil to the turbulence to settle down for a little bit, I think the market would be right back here. I don't know how much of that will get redone here before the end of the year. Time's kind of running short, and holidays always disrupt markets anyway. So, maybe we're going to kind of stay in this. Again, I'm still calling it a correction rather than a top in the market. But I think as we get into 2026, the fundamentals will reassert themselves. And again, if we ever get any data that suggests we are trying to retain some heifers, then we've got higher prices for probably at least a year after that before that would peak out.
Okay, there you have it, folks. The expert analysis from Dr. Peel with Oklahoma State. Thank you very much, Derrell, for being with me today. Absolutely intriguing conversation, and the cattle market will remain dynamic. And as you heard Dr. Peel say, the fundamentals haven't changed on the supply side or, in his opinion, on the demand side. So we'll see what lies ahead.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.